Thank you very much for coming. We do have quite a number of participants online, so we are more than you can see here in the room. I would like to thank Ambassador Brix and the team of the Diplomatic Academy very much for hosting us today, tomorrow, Friday and Saturday, because it's a sequence of 3 consecutive conferences taking place. And I thank Yanina Welp very much and the Cost Action to make this public roundtable possible tonight. We would like to talk about democracy, and we have heard time and again, democracy is in crisis. New forms of democratic participation and forming of political will are in the debate, and the deliberative democratic tools are only one of them. And we would like to discuss tonight how this can be achieved, how this can be utilized, and where and how we have to be aware of misunderstandings, of fallacies, and maybe of abuse. So I would like to take the freedom to introduce the distinguished panelists and Ambassador Brix, and our guest, our keynoter, Lukas to you briefly. Ambassador Emil Brix served in politics as a member of cabinet with a minister, and at a time when I received from this minister a stipend to study in Austria, Professor Tuppi, and then made a diplomatic career in diplomatic service as head of the cultural section of the Foreign Ministry, ambassador in London and in Moscow. And since 2017, you are the director of this diplomatic academy. Nationalrat Member of Parliament Lukas is a political scientist by education with a focus on environmental issues. Before being elected to the Austrian Parliament, the Nationalrat 2019, Lukas held positions in the NGO sector and served as an advisor to the Green Caucus in Parliament. Yanina Welp, head of our Cost Action, is a research fellow at the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. She's also an editorial coordinator at Agenda Publica and founder member of the Red de Politologas. Between 2008 and 2018, she has been principal researcher at the Center of Democratic Studies and co-director of the Zurich Latin American Center, both at the University of Zurich. She finished her habilitation in 2015 at the University of St. Gallen with a Vienna Legendi in Latin American Studies, and holds 2 bachelor's degrees in social communication and political science from the University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, her home country, a PhD in political and social science from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. Elena Garcia-Gutierrez is full professor of political science and administration in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the Autonomous University in Madrid, in Spain. Between 2009 and 2011, she was General Director of Relations with Las Cortes, the Spanish Parliament, in the Vice Presidency of the Government of Spain in the Ministry of the Presidency. She was visiting researcher at Harvard University and has taught at various European universities, such as Sciences Po in Bordeaux, Paris Dauphine, Warsaw, or Glasgow University. Jón Ólafsson, professor of comparative cultural studies at the University of Iceland, studied in Berlin, Iceland, Moscow, and Columbia, New York, where he received his PhD. Before joining Iceland University, he has served as provost, as somehow vice rector and dean of Bifrost University in Iceland. Among a number of rewards and prizes, John holds the 2012 prize for the best work non-fiction in Iceland. Appelsin nur fra Abkhazio, Orange von Abkhazien, which I have not read, John. Sorry. And last but not least, Peter Stone, Associate Professor of Political Sciences, Trinity College, Dublin. Peter studied at Penn State and Rochester. He served as Assistant Professor of Political Science in Stanford. He then spent a year in Tulane University Center for Ethics and Public Affairs before becoming Professor of Political Science at the Trinity College in Dublin. Me, myself, my name is Stefan Lütgenau. I'm heading the Foster Europe Foundation in Eisenstadt, which is co-host tonight. And without any ado, I would like to ask you, Mr. Ambassador, for some words.
Well, good evening and welcome from my side. As you heard, I'm director of the Vienna School of International Studies. It's a pleasure to have you all here and also online. This is a core topic that we discuss here quite regularly. Normally, we don't talk about fallacies of liberal or deliberative democracy, so I'm much looking forward to what is being discussed today and in the next few days. From my personal point of view, I think democracy lives from deliberation. And there is no democracy without deliberation. But I do understand that this is a question of definition, and maybe this is already one of the problems you're going to discuss where we are at the moment. I also have to say, when I read what we are supposed to discuss tonight, I thought about legitimacy, and what I heard so far is the discussion will say that the voting is the real legitimacy in a democracy, and deliberation is not an improvement necessarily of the quality of decisions or of more legitimacy to decisions. I allow myself to disagree. I would say deliberation is the core element of the quality of any democracy. And deliberation, as we discuss it here, is not something that is given from the governing people, but it is something that has to come from bottom up. This is very difficult, as we all know. Civil society is difficult to understand, but when we talk about problems that we have at the moment with legitimacy in politics, Austria is a good example where it does not work simply to have deliberation only from above. Even when we talk about climate change, the Austrians among us will remember that there was a meeting of a selected number of the public to deliberate on the future of how we should react to climate change. This has been somehow put into a box quite immediately, and I haven't heard anything about whether this was a participation, a contribution to the quality of democracy. And it certainly was something which was not before discussed in the public, but it was coming from above, in this case from the Minister of Energy. She wanted to prove that the public is behind her in the policies he's making. And I'm afraid it's an opening that I'm giving here, so I shouldn't be too opinionated, but I'm afraid this is not the future of democracy. The future of democracy has to find the ways of deliberation which really come from the civil society, and I include to this, again, point of discussion and maybe controversy, I include to this an improvement in the way we deal with direct democracy, the ways we find direct democracies. At the moment, at least in Austria, direct democracy is a code word for right-wing politics in Austria. And I think we should make everything possible that we change the situation. Direct democracy is something that belongs to us, to the public, to the population, and not to one sort of political party in Austria. I do know this is difficult, but that's why we're discussing these issues, and I wish you a very fruitful and constructive discussion. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, dear Mr. Ambassador, dear ladies and gentlemen. Thanks a lot for the kind invitation. I don't know if it was on purpose or if you knew that I was going to talk about the Klimarat, the Citizen Assembly on Climate Change, but that's what I'm going to do tonight. I'm the chairperson of the Environment Committee in the Austrian Parliament, and I'm the spokesperson on climate change for the Austrian Green Party. So my main field is climate policy. In 1992, I was a 9-year-old boy who was very excited about a new girl in school. I remember that very well. At that time, I didn't care about the fact that my chancellor at that time signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Rio de Janeiro with all the other leaders of the world. In that same year, Austria emitted more than 75 million tons of greenhouse gases. 5 years later, we signed the Kyoto Protocol, then the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol, and finally the Paris Agreement. In these treaties, we committed to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 13, then to 20, and then even to 100% of these emissions. These commitments were made based on a growing scientific consensus on the threats of climate change and the urgent need to act. But what exactly do we see 30 years after the birth of modern climate policy in Rio de Janeiro? How successful have we been in reducing our emissions since 1992? Well, in 1992, as I said, we were at 75 million tons of CO2 emissions. 30 years later, we were at 77 million tons of CO2 emissions, which is a slight increase instead of the decrease that we had committed to repeatedly. So I guess it's fair to say that we have a case of policy failure here. One could argue that this is not only a political failure, as it is technically not possible to reduce greenhouse gases. But we do know, however, that this is rather a political than a technical problem, as we already have most, if not all, technologies available to go to net zero. So there is a massive gap between what science has been telling us should be done and what has actually been done in the last 30 years. One could argue that our representative democracy has not been capable of solving this problem. It is therefore not really surprising that more and more voices from the climate movement have called for a citizen assembly on climate change. Something had to be done. After all, we have seen citizen assemblies in other countries like France, Ireland, and more recently in Germany. In a nutshell, the idea is that randomly picked citizens come together to discuss a societal problem and agree on measures to solve it. So how exactly did this start in Austria? And I slightly agree with your version. I try to explain. In 2020, more than 380,000 people in Austria signed a petition on climate action, the so-called Klimavolksbegehren, with which we dealt in the Parliament's Environment Committee. As the chair of this committee, my main aim was to implement as many demands as possible, and the establishment of a citizen assembly on climate change was one of these demands. In March last year, my colleagues and I finally managed to pass a resolution in the Parliament that requested the government, among other measures, to establish a citizen assembly on climate protection. The resolution passed with votes of the Greens, the Conservative Party, and the Liberal Party. 100 people starting from the age of 16 who lived in Austria permanently for a minimum of 5 years would be picked at random by a social science institute, in this case, Statistics Austria. The idea was that this group should be representative for the population in terms of gender, age, education, income, and place of residence. A mini Austria, as we called it. The text concerning the aims and the procedures was, of course, subject to very intense political negotiations. What should happen to the results, for example? Finally, we agreed that the Klimarat should discuss and develop concrete recommendations for the necessary climate protection measures to reach the Austrian climate targets. These recommendations should then be handed over to the government. That's basically the text. The Klimarat finally started in January 2022 and held 6 weekend sessions between January and June. The youngest participant was 17, the oldest was 79. The Citizen Assembly was supported and accompanied by scientists. It was also professionally moderated, and the stakeholder board was established to give different views to the members of the Klimarat, ranging from social environmental NGOs to labor union and to the Chamber of Commerce. All expenses were paid by the government. In addition, participants received €100 per weekend as allowance. On the 4th of July, so at the beginning of the summer, members of the Klimarat formally presented their results to the government. They agreed on 93 recommendations. These recommendations are not legislative proposals that could be directly adopted, but rather headline demands like end subsidies for fossil fuels. Of course, these headlines were always accompanied with further explanation that expanded the demands in more detail. Still, most of them are quite concrete. For example, no new passenger vehicles with combustion engines sold after 2027. As a government coalition, we have not yet agreed on how we will deal with the recommendations in the parliament, nor have we decided which of the recommendations we will implement. As with many other aspects of climate politics, our conservative coalition partner and we as Green Party have quite different views on the Klimarat in general and what should be done with its results. It is therefore too early to call what the impact of the Klimarat will become. I can, however, share some personal thoughts and observations. One of the main arguments against more ambitious climate policies has always been that the people are not ready for it. The Klimarat could prove this wrong. And in fact, the main messages participants had for me when I met them in July was, we are ready and do something now. That was the main message. And of course, a citizen assembly does not reflect the country's entire political spectrum. People who don't care at all are unlikely to participate. Nevertheless, the fact that the group is made up of a representative sample gives a certain degree of legitimacy. It did not come as a surprise, to me at least, that in the media we witnessed attacks on the Klimarat from those who have always blocked ambitious climate policies. Their aim clearly was to delegitimize the Klimarat and to frame it as a costly playing field of the Green Minister rather than a representative mini-Austria. While some attacked the institution, others praised it. Many small town mayors, for instance, were proud that the member of their small community was part of the Austrian Klimarat. Again, I wouldn't dare to finalize a conclusion here, but it's clear that the power of a citizen assembly depends on how much it is perceived as a representative and random sample that is able to work independently from the government members who start and fund the process. What we did not manage to do yet is to trigger a national debate. We also did not manage to frame the citizen assembly, and I think there's, for example, a difference to Ireland, to frame this citizen assembly as something that might be able to put an end to long discussions on the most controversial measures against climate change. So where we hand over the decision that we couldn't take in the government coalition to citizen assembly. This brings me to the main question: will the Klimarat lead to political decisions that would not have been taken without it? Some might worry that a citizen assembly is just another input to the normal policy cycle with the same pre-existing power structures. There are reasons why we have advanced so slowly in climate policy. We have economic interests and dominant power structures that remain unchanged. Again, this question must, for now, for me, remain unanswered. But interestingly, members of the Klimarat did not call for a national referendum, which would be a direct democratic instrument, on their proposal. What they want and what they told me is that we take, as politicians, that we take their recommendations seriously and that we discuss them and implement as many as possible, of course. I think it's not insignificant that as soon as the last session of the Citizen Assembly concluded, a large number of Klimarat members began to organize themselves and quickly founded their own association. It is quite clear that for many, the Klimarat triggered something. It politicized them. they might become something like a new NGO, or at least a new part of the Austrian climate movement, which is really interesting because their background really differs from all of the other members of the climate movement, because I visited them once in Salzburg. They were really, this was not really what people told us that it was, that it's only green people. It was really basically a very representative sample of Austria. Most of them quite conservative, I would say. However, one of my takeaways from these events is that in the beginning of these processes, we may need more political commitment to what we will actually do with the results. This needs quite some courage, as you don't know what the outcome will be. I tried to get this political commitment, to be honest, but I failed in the negotiation. I do believe that we need more elements of deliberation, but also of co-determination in our political system. And as you, Mr. Ambassador, said, a lot of people have lost faith in democratic institutions. But we will not and cannot restore faith if the illusions of participation and deliberation we create are not taken seriously. If we do this top-down, as we did, it is absolutely vital to take the outcome seriously, or at least to manage the expectations in order to avoid frustration. Do citizen assemblies on climate change develop any totally new measures? Do they advance knowledge in a policy field? I don't think so. But in climate policy, knowledge is not our problem. It is about political will. What the Klimarat, in my mind, definitely proves is that a lot of people in Austria do in fact support radical climate protection measures. From now on, I believe the excuse that the people are not ready for ambitious climate policy will be a lot harder to use. We will see how much of an impact the Klimarat will have and how much it will help us to correct this massive policy failure on the climate crisis. At the end of the day, this is what matters most for me. I want 9-year-olds to be excited about the new kid in school, and they should not be concerned if the planet they will inherit from us will still be livable. Thank you for your attention.
Very much. Thank you very much. Are there any direct questions to Lukas Hammer?
My name is Yanina, and I have one question to you. I saw that the Klimarat was more organized top-down from government. The other assemblies in France or in Germany, who organized them? You said that there were citizen assemblies. Who organized them? Were they top-down or were they bottom-up?
Well, we have political scientists here, but as far as I am informed, most of them were organized top-down. So, because you also have to see that you need some resources to organize these people, and because also in order to get a representative sample that a mother, family members, working people, that they can afford to leave their home for a weekend, 6 weekends, in fact. You need resources for that. They need to sleep somewhere, they need to eat, you need to pay a lot. So I think in Austria, so there was a discussion about that, but and as I said, I think you also need the political commitment in order, what do we do with the results. But yeah, that was top down.
Thank you very much. If there are no further questions, I would like to give the word to our panelists and start in the order as the program says. And Jon, you would be the first. I switch off.
I just have to excuse myself. I will have to leave a little bit earlier. So
yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll be the one to start. Thank you very much for inviting me to participate here. It's a really interesting setting, and I'm glad to be here. I have been in Vienna before, but that was 35 years ago, actually. Unbelievable. I'm going to actually allow myself to be a little bit philosophical in these initial remarks, but I hope we will then go further with that. So the question or the idea I'm supposed to be talking about is the fallacy of thinking that the decisions made by ordinary people are better than other decisions, presumably, although it's not explicitly said, made by politicians or officials or something of that sort, by governments. And of course, while I agree that this is a fallacy, it's a fallacy only if we think that this is inevitably the case. Clearly, there are cases where these decisions can be better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the fallacy or the idea that we can simply go to ordinary citizens for wisdom or for political will, as if that were the solution to things. So, and I think it's good to think about the two dimensions that we have in this. There is an epistemic dimension and there's a populist dimension there that we have to consider. So the populist dimension is based on the idea of the will of the people. It's not so much interested in knowledge. It's about will. And it's a non-inclusive conception because it is also usually based on an us versus them division. So the ordinary people on the populist account is not just everybody, it's a specific part of the population which is then made represent somehow the popular will. It is also a conception that we could, and this is sort of an indirect reference back to Rousseau, a transcendental rather than a deliberative idea of will or decision making, because it simply assumes that within this particular we the people group there is superior will formation. And this again is based on several arguments or assumptions. And the arguments tend to go towards degrading the other way to make decisions. So it's for instance, an argument based on corruption. Why is the ordinary people better to make decisions? It's because they are not corrupt. The officials are corrupt. They are the swamp. The system is corrupt. It's filled with self-serving people. It's filled with people who actually hate the ordinary people and so on. So that's one assumption or an argument that's pretty common. A different one is the argument from elites, which is not necessarily the same as saying the system is corrupt. It's something saying that, well, the usual decision-making structures of government are elites. And liberal politics, this is an argument we see a lot in Hungary, of course, I've seen for many years. The liberal politics is about strengthening and protecting the interest of the few. The people who already have the power are mainly interested in preserving that power for themselves and their peers, and so on. And there are other arguments as well, but I think the main thing that we can see, the main problem here is that the assumptions, of course, are wrong, or at least they are based on unexplained divisions. But even if they were not wrong, even if it were the case that we could talk about corruption or elites in the way that populists usually do, of course it doesn't follow that ordinary people are thereby very good at making decisions. So the conclusion doesn't follow, even if we live in an elite-driven society. And of course, to some extent, we obviously are. That doesn't lead to this conclusion about the power of the ordinary people. There's also, of course, in the populist sense, this tends to be non-deliberative because the populists are not so much interested in knowledge. They're also not very interested in deliberation. So that much about the populist account, or the populist way of claiming that ordinary people are good or better than everybody else at decision making. If we take the second dimension, the epistemic dimension, that is a much more respectable way to go these days, right? And something that's very much part of the discussion on deliberative democracy. So the second dimension is based on knowledge, clearly. It relies on arguments such as the argument from cognitive diversity, or something that I would call the argument from inclusion, but like with the populist perspective, we could also think of many other ways to explain this claim about the superiority or the supremacy of the ordinary people. So the argument from cognitive diversity follows from the claim that diversity trumps ability, in the sense that collective decision making is when made by a diverse group of people in a situation where bits or pieces of experience and knowledge residing in each participant, maybe passively, is going to play its role in a collective opinion formation, is a really fascinating argument, of course. But I think it's also one that is still very weak. It makes perfect sense, you know, and we can have models or even certain cases that seem to suggest that this is a very strong view. But I think we are far away from actually seeing this very clearly. And again, you know, that's the difference between saying that something is usually or necessarily the case of saying that something can, under certain circumstances, be the case. So the conclusion then is that under the right circumstances, the limited knowledge of individuals contribute to the more complete knowledge of the whole. And actually, I'm tempted to comment on the climate assembly that Lukas was talking about, because clearly we can agree that this is not about knowledge. We know enough about the dangers ahead, but it's about, you know, will. It's about how things should be done. But it's also maybe about knowledge in this particular sense, because one of the things that an assembly of ordinary people could do is to collect unexpected experiences and knowledges that would not come up in the policy debate on the higher level. So that also is knowledge in some sense, I would argue at least. But the cognitive diversity claim is also problematic because it is not necessarily based on inclusion. And since the diversity is cognitive rather than emotional or valuational, it doesn't really care so much about exactly who is the ordinary people. It could be a mini-public selected in some acceptable way. It could be a crowdsourcing exercise with self-selected participants. This is, I think, a weakness also in this position. So there's another argument which would go more for the idea of inclusion, arguing that if we have like a mini Austria, we actually are ensuring that all the necessary experiences, values, and so on are there. And that in this case, we are in a position to talk about decision-making that can be better or more informed than decision-making made on the higher level. It would ensure that cultural, social groups that need to be included are there. But I think also that this is something that we actually it assumes that that this sort of statistical representation can be better than representation based on other ways to select candidates like elections, and I think there's also we are still a long way from actually being able to say anything very interesting about this. But again, I would say we are very much on the experimental level. This is a situation where we could definitely see something going on, but it's not something we can take for granted. So it's also good to keep in mind that both the populistic and the epistemic dimensions, they can be deliberative or non-deliberative. Some epistemic Democrats are not necessarily so interested in deliberation. There are also other ways to go for decision making. What is common across the populist and epistemic dimensions is also doubts about representation, and this is also, I think, an additional and a different problem that I'm not going to talk about here. So one problem with the epistemic dimension is also that it tends to look at complicated and sometimes political ideological problems as simple. So political discussion becomes a problem-solving discussion, and I think this is also a weakness. And the problem with populism, well, maybe I don't have to even talk about that, but it's clearly that it's based on an illicit and arbitrary division of who belongs to the ordinary people. So neither provides a sufficient framework for actually a notion of deliberation that is in the end useful. Neither can detect how deliberative experiences enrich thinking about political issues. And I think to think about this sort of fallacy of decision making is instructive also about how we want to think about deliberation itself. There's been a lot of discussion for years about institutionalizing deliberation or thinking about deliberation in a systematic way as part of institutional structures. And I think the fallacies of that we're talking about here should maybe suggest that thinking about deliberation in a way that enriches debates rather than leads us to better decision making necessarily might be one way to go. I also think that one problem with the epistemic position is the hesitancy to go beyond cognitive diversity and to value diversity and emotional diversity. So I think I'm just going to stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan. Yeah. Two challenges to deliberation from two different angles that are not closely, supporting or interested in deliberation, but it might be a trap. Let us just go directly to the next speaker. It's you, Yanina, and you talk about. I have to take off my glasses on participation versus representation.
Yeah. Thank you. So good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Cost Action on Constitution Making and Deliberative Democracy, I want to start by thanking the Diplomatic Academy for hosting this event, and especially Stefan Lütgenau and his team, Foster Europe, for all the efforts I'm aware you have made, the energy and the time devoted to make it possible. So thank you. When we had our exchanges thinking how to start this conversation and we identified these fallacies, as Stefan said before, we had in mind this idea of the misunderstandings, the abuses. I don't know if all of us, but at least me, I'm convinced that participation and deliberations are required to resolve some problems. But from this point is from where we are also criticizing some abuses and misunderstandings. And now, when finally conducting this roundtable, we have a contextual fact quite disturbing, I would say, and I would like to briefly go over it because I think it's an amazing example to take into account, and we will follow in the next days discussing that. these tensions, these abuses, and these misunderstandings we are considering. And I'm talking about Chile. The last Sunday, there was a constitutional referendum, and in this referendum, probably the most innovative, democratic, participatory process of constitution making was rejected by more than 70% of the population, with 87% of participation. And to go briefly over it, this started in 2019 with with social upheaval, demonstrations, the estallido, we said in Spanish, and it opened room for a constitutional replacement, a bit unexpected, in the more stable country in Latin America, one of the highest quality of democracy according to the rankings, and with a lot of problems, but still one of the most economically developed countries, etc., etc. So the crisis of the representation was in there. From this starting point, the political parties in power, with all this disaffection we are mentioning here, agreed on conducting a referendum, the entry referendum, which opened room with more than 70% of support to the constitutional replacement. After that, this referendum was in October 2020. In May 2021 was the election of the constitutional conventionals. They were directly elected, was the first process in the world in which there was gender parity, so equal representation for females and males. There was also indigenous representation, first time in Chile. There was a decision also to allow independents to run for the position. So independents had a prominent role in the convention. Also, political parties, new and old, were represented. So in terms of descriptive representation, nothing like that happened before in Chile. It was the highest democratically representative, descriptively representative assembly in the country. Then after that, the process was transparent, and there were many forms of citizen participation following the process. However, it was defeat. So before we were talking about taking seriously the citizens' claims to avoid frustration, and here what we have is that this is not enough, and this is the point. And I will focus now in my fallacy, let's say, to try to go a bit in depth on that. Because what we should avoid, I think, is simple connections. And what we are taking here as a problematic thing is this idea of just injecting deliberation and participation to linearly resolve the pitfalls of representation. And I identified here, I want to focus in what with Gisela Sarenberg, in a work we developed together, identified as the 4 myths behind the conception of participation and deliberation. We can take it together, despite there also things which would deserve more discussion. The first myth we call the Russonian myth. The second is the myth of the single word, participation as a single word. The third is the myth of eliminating intermediation. And the fourth is the myth of taking the vote as an exclusive element of representation. So the Russonian myth refers to, I think John already mentioned it a bit, the idea that the assembly is the ideal democratic model. And it has also theoretical roots, further theoretical roots, because, for instance, Hannah Pitkin took it, and in an amazing, very interesting work, she developed this idea, which arrives till now, that representation is a kind of second best. Because the assembly is not possible, because direct participation is not possible, then we take representation. It's not the best, but it's what we have. And then the problem here is that participation is not the opposite of representation. Participation, as Plotke, Urbinati, and other scholars have also analyzed, is the opposite of abstention. And representation is the opposite of exclusion. And this is part of the thing. Participation and representation are not opposite, but different dimensions which are equally relevant for the good working of democracy. The second myth, the myth of the single word. As already was commented here, we have referendums, and it allows electoral participation. We have citizens' assemblies, and then we have deliberation and advice. We have many forms of participation, and each one deserves attention. I have studied a lot a particular form of participation, such as the recall referendum. The recall referendum, in some contexts, can, in place of improving or resolving problems, create new problems, because it erodes the political party system, for instance. So it's not that participation resolves, we have to go in depth in what participation means, and as the representative of the Greens said, we have also to discuss what we do, for instance, with the results of a citizens' assembly. Also, this discussion suggested here about what is a top-down or a bottom-up citizens' assembly and how it works. We have many more dimensions on the table. Then the myth of eliminating intermediation. I think this is also a very relevant point in our discussion, because normally representation is observed as a bad result because of the mediation of the people, the representative, the political party. However, in any form of participation, we have mediations too. And we have to consider that. In a referendum, the number of signatures, the threshold to validate a referendum, the majorities required, the way to formulate the questions. In a citizens' assembly, who moderates it? How much time will be devoted for a discussion? The experts is a very powerful thing. We have discussed a lot within our action about it. Who selects the experts? I think it's not so difficult to understand the many ways in which a process is influenced and could be even manipulated. And finally, the vote as an exclusive element of representation. And this is problematic for the representation as it works now, but it's also problematic because there are other forms of representation which are also important to build trust and community and are not considered, like recognition, authorization, expertise. All this also plays a role when we talk about representation, and we should not identify representation as only fed by the vote, electoral representation. So to finalize also, I want to say that all these elements and what we are discussing now is not just a theoretical disquisition, a discussion with no effects. Because let's go back to Chile, the misunderstandings on how to resolve the problems of representation are behind that. Of course, the result in Chile is multicausal, and there are contextual factors very important to be considered, and we shouldn't say it's just the problem of the crisis of representation. But I'm convinced that it plays a role, because we here are also analyzing all these instruments, asking for these instruments, and some of us even intervening in the institutional designs. So we should really carefully consider these fallacies to avoid further problems and increasing this crisis we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yanina.
Okay, I'm the third one participating in this roundtable, and what I'm going to do is to try to connect some of the things they have already been talking about, because there are some members of the COS Action that professionally we are making this reading and reading about this and debating about this, but there are other people in the audience, and I think what we can do as political theorists is to clarify a little bit what are really we talking about, and which are, as Yanina says before, the political implications. This is very important, because I don't know, but I have very young students, I have my daughter now, and my question is, well, these people, they are just listening about, this crisis of democracy, the crisis of representation, the crisis of everything. And I'm really very, very concerned about clarifying what are we talking about. So starting very briefly, because I don't want to be very boring, and as Yanina explained very well before, in this roundtable, we are speaking a little provocatively about the fallacies of deliberation, but because all of us, we are very interested in these things, we want to introduce changes, but at the same time, we want to be very critical with some discourses and some political implication of using these strategies, these changes, these concepts in ways that are dangerous for democracy. And at the end, on what I think we all agree is that in the present situation, we need to make a basic defense of democracy, and after being very critical, as we always are. So, about legitimacy. I think there is an abuse of the term crisis of legitimacy or processes of delegitimation. And we have to differentiate very seriously what is a real deficit of legitimacy of a regime as a regime. In some moments, there is a crisis, there are strong crises in different contexts, in different moments, different periods. And we need to reflect very seriously about what is happening, which are the causes, etc. But at the same time, there is an abuse in the sense that, we tend to use this vocabulary also to refer to the normal, and the normal debates and disagreements that characterize our democracy. You don't like the procedure, you don't like this policy that has been approved, etc. So we use it in both senses. And I think we need first to distinguish which is the level we are moving on. There has been a period with crisis, and I wonder always if there are crises of democracy, or there are different crises that democracy have been or have tried to approach and to solve. And this is something that is different. So is democracy the cause of our problems, or democracy precisely are evolving, trying to solve problems that are not caused by democracy? So sometimes in the discourses, this is a little messy, and just to clarify, let's clarify these things because they are important. So there is a crisis, or at least I will say a deep evolution of not just of our democracies, but our world, our states, etc. And democracies are trying also to adapt and to find solutions. And I think one of the fields of thought and the theories that have been trying to propose things and to propose them positively, I will say, are these proposals that come from a very big and wide family that are the deliberatives, the deliberative family. There's those proposing and thinking and reflecting on our democracies, rejecting some ideas and theories. We are not speaking exactly about realities, but ideas and ways of looking at democracies that, think that democracy is just in the, for example, Schumpeterian views, just to go there to vote to an elite that has nothing to do with the citizens, minimalist theories, I will say, or the others that they just see a world of people in democracy just trying to pursue their private interests and fighting just to, and some institutions to aggregate that. So as the ambassador first started with, but he stopped there, is that the idea of democracy involved already this need of debating about things or constructing something together or thinking on constructing a common good that is not just the result of these individuals looking for their own, advancing their own preferences already articulated and interests. This is a very general idea. But all the the positions around this idea of deliberation are focusing this other part of that is already present in our democracy, but many times not developed or not articulated. So this is in democracy, the citizens, we have the capacity also, and we should debate about the things. This is related, for example, with the questions of climate change. We don't take for granted that there is an objective knowledge that, a technocrat should tell us to follow or to develop or to apply directly. We need to debate because politics is about debating, and it's about debating between things that sometimes collide. For example, another example related with the previous presentation. We know what is happening with the climate. We have an expert knowledge about that. But also we are seeing in the present circumstances how hard it is to decide about how to balance all these, in this context, all these things that, we want to follow these compromises, but at the same time, we are going to run out of gas and we want to continue with the sanctions or not. And this is how politics is about. It's about deciding, and these decisions are never just guided by an objective knowledge that some expert can give to us. That's why, and the ambassador was right on that, there is always a discursive element in our democracy. And we need to be aware of that because in the normal political context, in ordinary debates, we tend to forget that this is also a strong component of democracy. In this sense, I'm going to differentiate on this white picture of a general deliberation that is constitutive of democracy. Liberal or ancient or any democracy is a constitutive element. But the way deliberation works on the system changes from one model to another, from one context to another. Depends on how the institutions are working, which is the role of the citizens through other, as Yanina says, through other mechanisms of participation, and there are many mechanisms of participation, always they have been there. And there are many mediators that become representative of the citizens, as for example, civil society are. So an important distinction is to think on deliberation as this systemic property. We have democracy, and there are different moments of deliberation on the system. There are different ways of deliberating about the common good on institutions, on outside institutions. And I will say, for example, when we are speaking about these citizen assemblies, they are top-down because they are instruments, yes, instruments to institutionalize a type of participation. A type of participation. That's why we cannot, or we reject, and I think we share this, all the participants on the round table. The idea is that you create this mini public, and really this is, this is the will of the people, the real will of the people. This is what we really question. But there are good instruments, mechanisms, to have some normative goals, to achieve some normative goals. And as you say, not all at the same time. Or you also say. Maybe we, finally with this citizen participation mini-publics or assemblies, we educate but a group of people. This is good for them, but this is not all the citizens. Or maybe we can reach a solution that is really creative and good, as for example, as some cases in the experience in Ireland with the constitutional reform that have been very positive. Or sometimes, and we are not talking, we have to be very careful of the differences of a mini-public, but an elected body in the experience of Chile. and the result is not so good as a specific instrument, but very good from the perspective of a very, very deliberative process in itself that doesn't need to be closed. So I was debating with Yanina before about this and saying, well, we have all the interpretations, but please, none of them has to be like a failure. No, this has been good. A very good experience with a lot of decisions that have been adopted and that has created in society a wide debate on many things about how we articulate our way of life, our democracy, how we should organize the institutions. And some of the comments are like saying, well, you know, this is Pinochet again. No, no, this is not Pinochet again. So these simplistic readings, you know, are the ones that we are, in a way, trying to criticize with our interventions. So I will say, and I will connect with a couple of things that we have already are on the table, is that in this sense, we have the systemic deliberation of democracies, and to see and to analyze and to assess the quality of the system is something complex. It's not that we have created a mini public and then it's a very, very deliberative system. No, we have to see how this is connected with a parliament, how is the quality, the numbers, the representativeness of civil society, because we need a lot of different interactions of the system. And the assess of all of this is something that, you know, is interpretative, is something that is qualitative, and we need to see in each society how this works. And I would like to differentiate this from what is also very common, that to think that deliberation is just a procedure. It's a very, very specific procedure to reach some decisions. Because, and there are these contradictions that my colleagues were talking about. Then if you prepare a deliberative process involving citizens, you know, that fulfills all these requirements, and the outcome is not so good, or is rejected by citizens speaking with other voice or other forms of representation, what we have here. So we have to be very careful when we are, of course, in political theory, we cannot say, well, deliberation should be just this, and just to, to give just a definition. But what we ask the others is, well, in which sense are you using deliberation? And which is the normative stand that you are adopting to make your descriptions and to make your assessment when you are analyzing all these processes and all these realities that are so complex, but also, I will say, so different, and we need to be really very careful when just taking conclusions from all of this. And I stop here, and we can continue after in the debate.
Thank you very much, Yanina. Thank you very much, Yanina. Last but not least, I would ask Peter Stone for his words.
Okay, thank you. I was asked to talk about the fallacy that deliberation is in any case democratic. And I should start by mentioning that when this event was announced tonight and the topic I was going to be addressing got announced, it led at least one person to look up my email address and send me an email and say, "Do you really think that?" So I don't know if the gentleman who sent me that message is in the audience. If you are, hello. I'm going to try to answer the question. I think the short answer to the question is I think that the relationship between deliberation and democratic is a complicated one, and I'm going to talk about three questions I think that one needs to think about if you think about the relationship between deliberation and democracy. So the first one is kind of the easy and obvious one, although its applications, I think, is not easy and obvious. And it's a question of, are we dealing with real deliberation here? This is the perpetual fear of skeptics about deliberative processes, is to say, this is a stage-managed process. You know, the strings are being pulled behind the scenes to make sure that the process generates the outcomes that people want. And it's a continual fear. And it's particular a fear that gets raised when less than fully democratic societies try to put forward with a big show deliberative processes. One of the reason I think this one is a complicated one to consider, theoretically it's kind of straightforward and simple. Yeah, sham deliberation is bad, and we certainly would not want to call that democratic. What is, I think, interesting is the fact that the question of whether you are going to have real versus sham deliberation or not, I don't think divides very neatly into the case of, oh, well, you've got non-democracies, you'll get the sham, and when you've got real democracies, you'll get the genuine article there. This is certainly, I think, not been the experience of experiments with deliberative democracy around the world. For example, there have been a number of what are called deliberative opinion polls, these randomly selected citizens' assemblies that have been run in the People's Republic of China. And you might immediately think these have to be stage-managed affairs, but you know, I think there is a lot of evidence to suggest that they often aren't stage-managed affairs, that you have local political officials who genuinely have situations where, like, I want to know what will make the local people most happy with me, and I've got to create one of a number of public works projects, and do I create the new town plaza, or do I do something else? So I'll have a citizens' assembly, and if they say they want the new sewer system, well, I'm going to give them the new sewer system. So it is not a sham in that kind of cases. It might have a very restricted agenda, which is the second question I'm going to get to, but it is, I think, would be hard to call it a sham in the case like that. On the other hand, within democratic societies, there is, I think, often a genuine fear of interjecting deliberation into processes that were previously non-deliberative. And it's for exactly the reason that Lukas Hammer eloquently pointed out before, is that introducing deliberation takes courage, because you cannot, if it's genuine deliberation, stage manage the outcome. You don't quite know what you're going to get, and you need to be able to live with that. One very interesting book I would recommend on this subject is a book called Hope for Democracy by John Gastill and Kathleen Knobloch. I reviewed it recently, and they talk about the efforts to introduce deliberation into the referendum process in the state of Oregon in the United States. And what is interesting is the number of players there who got very, very nervous about these experiments. And they were not, as you might expect, traditionally. You might say, oh, well, it'll be the business community that will be suspicious, or it'll be the right wing of the political spectrum that will be suspicious. As John and Kathleen very honestly, and I think very candidly to their credit, document, it was often the most kind of important left-wing social justice organization in the state that was very, very nervous about these deliberative experiments. And the reason is because they thought they had a handle on the political process. They knew how you lobby. They knew how you work the media. They know how to, those kind of things. And so now you're introducing a factor that's not within the standard set of things they control. And they were, and as far as I know, are still a bit suspicious and standoffish about these kind of efforts there. So I think we all want to be concerned about sham deliberation and recognize it as non-democratic, but we also want to be aware that exactly when and where there will be a danger of restrictions on real deliberation or challenges to real deliberation. It's not obvious. It could come up in surprising places. The second question I want to ask about the relationship between deliberation and democracy is to what extent does scope play a role here? One of the things that is often said about deliberation, again, this comes back to its unpredictability, is you have to give it the scope to go wherever the deliberation takes it. And this is often something that within political processes can be hard to achieve. There are other agents who are wary about the idea of saying, well, Really, you can take that anywhere you like? And again, this is a problem that transcends the line between non-democracies and democracies trying to do this. I think, of course, as I mentioned before, the Chinese government is concerned about deliberative processes that would have an unlimited scope. It will never create those, at least if it's in its current form, but it will be okay with more limited sets of scope. But the same kind of issue can arise within democracies. Democratic governments are often very wary of deliberative processes that have a scope that goes too far. Having said this, of course, deliberation itself also has an amazing power to flow outside of its bounds there, or at the very least to generate challenges. And I think it's often unpredictable exactly the nature of the kind of challenges it will pose. This is something that Ned Crosby, the creator of the citizen juries in the United States, said, is that often for very specific reasons, if he convened a citizen jury because a local or state government wanted to hear what people thought about something, they would be presented with a very specific menu of options of, so you're talking about healthcare reform in Wisconsin, and you will give them, these three kinds of regulation kind of schemes, or introduction of markets in this area and all of that. And if you talk about healthcare, of course, there will always be someone in the room who will say, but there's that choice D, what about the government getting involved in this? What about the single-payer option in Canada? What about the public healthcare system option? And when the people organizing these events want to say, yeah, but that's not what we're here to talk about, there will be people who will say, oh, I think it is what we are here to talk about there. Thank you very much. And so being able to ensure that the boundaries of deliberation remain where they are set initially is often uncertainty. So I guess you could say it's a second level of uncertainty on top of deliberation. And so it's a second kind of question one has to think about, is this relationship there is like, to what extent are efforts to compose constraints on the deliberation automatically undemocratic? The third question, I think, that gets raised about the relationship to deliberation and democracy. And it's one where we say, okay, let's say we have a process that is genuinely deliberative. It's not a sham, it's a genuine deliberation. And let's say that we are happy with the scope. It is as wide as the deliberative process wants it to be. How confident will we be in its democratic credentials? Do we know clearly how to say, I am happy to call this a democratic process, and I will happy to call this a democratic process? This is a very real question in the history of deliberation, I think. One of the most important early books on deliberative democracy, in fact, I think it might have been the book that introduced the term into the English language, was a book about the United States Senate as a deliberative body, the mild voice of reason, it's called. And the United States Senate has long been regarded as one of the most deliberative parts of the United States government. It's not right now, but we're talking 40 years ago here. There actually was a golden age compared to what we have now. It's it would be hard for it to work much worse, but where there was a genuine ability of people to transcend party lines, transcend ideological lines, and to have an actual exchange of reasons. It was, of course, limited, but no deliberative process is perfect. But of course, the democratic credentials of the United States Senate have also always been very limited. It's one of the least democratic parts of the United States government, and indeed it is the one that has been perhaps the most elitist in its composition, the one that has been most restricted to wealthy white men throughout US history. So that raises the question of, well, okay, if we say, we want the not just to be a genuine deliberation, not just to be a genuine process in which people come together and exchange reasons and try to find out what's the right thing to do, but a process that is democratic on top of that, what does that commit us to? And here I think there is an actual tension in the debates that people have about this, particularly when you look at the mini-public, which is one of the most common instruments that is put forward as a deliberative reform idea. The idea, as in Austria, as was the case in France, as has been the case in Ireland, and in a number of other places, which says we're going to convene a random selection of citizens. It will include citizens from all walks of life, and they will come together, and they will be the deliberative body that will have the genuine exchange of deliberation. And let's say that my first two questions are answered successfully. They have genuine deliberation and a proper scope, however you define the proper scope there. What are the democratic credentials of the results? And the tricky thing here, I think, is that there seem to be two kind of answers that you can give to this. One kind of answer is the answer that says, look, this was a fully inclusive process. You want no segment of society to be excluded? They were all there. None was excluded. You want every citizen to have an equal chance to take part? They all had an equal part. You have perfect inclusiveness and equality. So whatever your democratic credentials are, you've ticked the box. So that raises the question of why would you need to do anything else? You bring together the Citizen Assembly, you've got the democratic answer. What else do you need? The other answer, of course, is the one to say, well, now hang on. Doesn't democracy have something to do with the demos? Doesn't it have something to do with all of us coming together to have a say in the matter? So how could you possibly just say that a random sample could do all the deliberating for us? Surely we, all of us, have to come together and be a part of that deliberation. But that creates this kind of funny place for deliberative mini-publics. You look at them from one angle, and they're everything for deliberative democracy. You look at them from another angle, and they're nothing from deliberative democracy. It all seems to be they might have other virtues, of course, epistemic virtues, and as was talked about before, but what kind of democratic credentials do they have? And I think this is from a theoretical perspective, one of the great challenges there, because I'm someone who's very enthusiastic about the role and the contribution that deliberative mini-publics are making to the process. I think it is a very real role, but there remains these very, I think, deep and difficult questions about the democracy side of these processes. We want to say they're deliberative, fine, but what about the democracy side? What makes them so democratic? They seem to have a democratic place, a democratic role to play, but the nature of that role, I think, is one of our most challenging kind of tasks to think about. So that's all I have to say. I'll leave that here.
Thank you very much, Peter. I don't want to sum up any of your papers or comments. I just would like to directly give the floor to the audience and collect perhaps 2 or 3 questions, and then we try to answer them. Please, here. Just wait for the mic, please. The mic is coming.
So I want to say one thing. I'm not totally against the deliberation process, but what I definitely think first, if you do this can be only one instrument in the democracy, and it certainly cannot replace other instruments. Second, I think if you do this, you have to make very clear and very open how you choose the people who are, the criteria you have for choosing the people who are part of this deliberation process. And third, I think very often this deliberation process can be substituted by simply a referendum, because the referendum has the nice addition that you ask everybody, if you have a referendum, I can go and vote. If there is this deliberation process, I cannot go when I was not chosen. And I'm chosen top-down, as we heard.
Thank you very much. Any other comment, any other question? Yes, please.
Hello. My name is Evan Casella. Thank you very much, everyone, for the wonderful discussion. Really appreciate that. My question has to do with constitutional change to include more deliberation. I don't know if you're aware of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, currently under discussion in Australia, where it's potentially going to cause a referendum to include more Indigenous representation in the Australian Parliament. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on constitutional referendum to include more deliberation.
Thank you very much. Here's
Yes, I'd sort of like to throw in some ideas here. I think the environment within which the deliberation takes place is an important consideration. These days, we see this new phenomenon called fake news, and how people taking part in a deliberation can be influenced by interested parties. I'd like to, just an example, use Brexit. Just how much fake news was thrown into that. And I would go so far as to say a large proportion of the UK population were hoodwinked by some interested parties who were allowed to have a lot of influence on the deliberation concerning that subject. And there are a few other examples I could use, but I think that's a good one. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like Thomas here, the first row.
Thank you. I think why this discussion is so relevant is because there's an evident failure at the present moment of our democratic, deliberative institutions, a mix between them, to deliver the decisions that are urgently needed. Just as in case of Austria, I mean, first the climate policy was the most blatant example, where we have been unable for 40 years now to do what is necessary, but many other examples. Everybody knows in Austria that, for instance, the pension age has to be raised, and so. But the democracy, the deliberative as it is not capable of delivering that. And I want to add another aspect, in this process of deliberation, of course, there are many different levels, but one thing is where the input of the political, the wishes, so to say, what you want to have, is faced with the reality of the objective constraints, and the objective possibilities, which is incorporated in the administration, in various ministries, and this is a very strategic level. And one of the problems which we have in Austria today is that the quality of the administration has declined, and this discussion between the experts and the political has been distorted to the advantage of media managers, secretaries of ministers, to populism, if you wish to think. Just to repeat the obvious, we are faced with a serious crisis of democratic institutions to deliver what is necessary. On the global level, and here in Austria also, I think the parliament is basically dysfunctional in Austria and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 4 different questions. Who would like to start? Whatever we heard about transparency and the clear regulations for deliberation.
Maybe I should just not necessarily answer all the questions.
No. Yeah.
But there's maybe one thing about the first point, deliberation versus referendum, where I think the point in deliberation and what makes it so different from a referendum is the idea that you can actually have people change their minds, right? So, and I think you mentioned China. I think you were referring to the deliberative polls there, right? So that's also one of the, ideals of deliberation. That unlike a referendum, which is just sort of a quick decision, undiscussed maybe, or discussed in a way or under a context that might be flawed in many ways, you create these conditions, and they can be of different kinds. Deliberative poll is sort of a clinical effort to create such a forum where people not only talk and change their mind, but you believe, and this is, of course, something we can also discuss, that the views they come to after having deliberated are better than the views they had before, more thought, more informed, and so on. And I think that's maybe one of the things that is difficult to leave from the idea of deliberation, that people who have deliberated are somehow more authorized to say something about an issue they have deliberated about, and therefore, for this epistemic reason, they should be listened to. I mean, this does not, of course, not say everything about deliberation, but I think it's very important to talk about the great distinction between a referendum, which is, of course, a very flawed way. I think everybody, well, I'm sure we would probably agree on that in some way at least. Well, maybe I should stop here. Maybe you want to say something about Chile.
Yeah, please.
I follow. Yeah, I agree, but I also disagree. In fact, it's in the middle, because this is again how we expect institutions to work and how institutions work. If you look at referendums, the campaign is the place to have the different opinions, a public debate on that, to hear different opinions. And in many occasions, and I can give maybe 2 examples of that, before the referendum, most of the population was in favor of something, and the day of the vote, the result was opposite. Let's take Spain and the OTAN entry. Is a perfect example to talk about that, the relevance of the campaign. And there is a similar example in Brazil, completely different topic and context with the weapons tendency, personal tendency. People was against that, and was a referendum to avoid it, but at the end the campaign was so effective that they changed their opinion. So ideally a referendum should be not this Brexit example, which is, or the plebiscite, the peace plebiscite in Colombia, 2 examples of how this works very badly. But then again, we go to the institutional designs, and in both cases are very badly designed. In the case of Brexit, for what was people voting? Was no agreement, was unclear what will happen, was a fight among parties, was a clear strategy from one of the parties, and then the idea was, let people to decide. But if you seriously take that as an option, then you have to organize a series of referendums, more than one. And this didn't happen. And in the case of Colombia, the referendum was about an agreement of 300 pages, from the moment in which was published, and the referendum was a month, I think, or something like that, and the debate was plenty of fake news. So I understand that a mini public or a citizens' assembly are organized in a completely different situation than in a referendum, but ideally a referendum should also have a process of access to information, public debate, etc., etc., etc. So I think it's an interesting point.
Yeah, please.
That's why it's important what I was talking about before, from this systemic view, in the sense that
I think your mic is not on.
it's important to combine different strategies and mechanisms. In this sense, what happened in Chile is good because all this process has shown to the citizens which are the problems, where the debate is, etc. And after there is a referendum with a wide majority, then what they say is the conversation needs to continue. And for example, the Brexit was the opposite in the sense that, for the exit of the European Union was a major constitutional change in a country where they don't have constitution, but they changed the institutional basis, and they didn't require a kind of reinforced majority. What is crazy, because it's something that is important, because that shows that at least, you have this majority. I remember Theresa May just taking the microphone and say, the citizens have spoken and they want to leave the Brexit. And I say, no, half of the citizens have said we want to stay, and half of the others, even, if when you have a referendum, you need to put, a result to take the decisions. But what they show is what the citizens that are very different are thinking about the things. So the referendum, just without this previous work and debates in many different settings, in parliaments, in civil society, in the press, etc., are not so interesting, but at the same time, they contribute to create or to involve in the debate people that usually they are out of that. So it has another benefit. The best thing is to combine the different instruments, and sometimes it happens like in Chile, that they need to continue because there is no something like this.
I would like to get back to your question concerning the deliberative practices and constitution making. This is exactly what our cost network is about, and we are breaking our heads for 3 years now. So I'm hesitant, and I don't know whether you get a proper answer. This is still in debate, but this is what we are talking about. There is still the point of the democratic system and the political system not delivering, and diminishing quality of decision making and civil service and parliament and legislation here in Austria, perhaps in others. And we touched a little bit the fake news problem. But would you like to comment on the deficit, please?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very important point, and I think it is often overlooked, the fact that there is, I think, a not coincidental decline, there's not a coincidental decline in democracy, this democratic deficit growing, but there's also at the same time, I think, just this decline in state capacity and state ambition there. I mean, and let's be clear, there has been a deliberate, conscious effort for 50 years or so, since the high point of the so-called big government in the Western democracies in the 50s and 60s, to destroy the idea that governments are capable of doing large and ambitious projects. So they're just not capable of doing it, even though they obviously did. It's like they basically, if you scream bumblebees can't fly often enough, you'll convince a lot of people of that. And I mean, the response to the pandemic, I mean, I'm looking at my home country, the United States, and the UK, and this was, I thought, particularly extraordinary. I'm like, didn't you two countries beat Hitler at one point? I mean, that was pretty big. You mobilized on an extraordinary scale at one point there. Now, I admit, looking at who's in charge at the time in the United States and the UK, okay, this ain't Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, but I mean, it is part of this more general symptom that of just a sort of a decline in capacity, but it's also connected to this failure of being willing to sort of and able to try to mobilize the public and say, hey, this is a big deal. We all now have to get out there and work on this together there. And that has been when democracies have accomplished the most, that has been an essential part of the process. And that's been something I think that governments have just frankly forgotten how to do. They've lost the knowledge of how to do that because they're out of practice with that. And that's very dangerous.
Can I add something very quickly? There is a reference to this supposedly golden age, but I will say that this is very ethnocentric in the sense that it refers to some countries that really were very powerful and with the capability of introducing a lot of changes and controlling what was happening inside. Now the reality, as you say, is that we are globalized, but we are confronting. Well, before they had huge problems, as for example this nuclear threat also in this time, and not the capacity to solve it, but just constructing more weapons and these things. But now it's clear that, and I say, it's not a question of democracy, but the question of the scope and of the problems that we want to solve with our democracies, and this has changed. We are more ambitious because we think that we can really change a lot of things and solve these huge problems. And that's the point, that we are asking our democracy that before didn't have so many instruments, neither, but some of them more than the others, much more than the others. And now we are like feeling this sense of, this golden past, but I think at the same time there is a more extended conscience on the need to really cooperate in many areas to try to solve them, and this is positive, and this is something new also.
Anything else you would like to add? Anything concerning the fake news problem?
I have two things.
Yeah?
I'm talking too much? Yes.
No.
Others? Yeah, about fake news, this is very interesting because in some of the literature, the academic literature on deliberation, now there is a stress on the fact that the specific mini-publics with these specific procedures, I'm not just looking at deliberation from this more wider view, but this type of mechanism, they are a weapon against precisely a debate that has been perverted by these, manipulations, fake news, etc. It's the idea that with these experiments, you can create a kind of reasonable environment when people can really think and reflect on their own preferences with the right information without a lot of manipulation. This is already in the works of Niemeyer, of Fishkin, and many other colleagues that are working and defending the extension of this type of deliberative pools, etc. Because they insist on the fact that, this public sphere is really perverted and it's very difficult to really find ways to have a more fair and a debate. This is very important, based on, I will say, objective knowledge, or a knowledge that has a more, scientific base, etc. So they are proposing this type of instruments also to add an input to public debate when they pretending to really be able to debate, just leaving aside this type of discourses that has infected our societies and still are infecting these societies. I don't agree fully with them, but at the same time, I think, as I say, that these instruments can give an input precisely to these debates and help at least to reject some of these noises that are really don't have any basis. It's not just to correct or to cut the ideological debate or to cut the pluralism that is like another pillar of our democracies. But at least in this public debate, again, just to say, well, there is a different type of basis to support some positions, political positions, and this is very interesting.
I'd just like to throw something else.
Wait a second for the mic, because...
Yes, Peter, you made this comment, something along the lines of we're lacking people who are able to mobilize the masses. I think we've seen some very good examples recently, but the problem is they're working in the wrong direction. I would suggest Donald Trump, and to a lesser extent, Boris Johnson, were extremely good at mobilizing the masses. Both of them using fake news, but both very effective. So I think that's something that's something we have to take into account. Thank you.
Directly. Go directly.
I was to say, I agree with you about the ability of them to mobilize, but it is very interesting to note the kind of mobilization that they are capable of there. In terms of if you ask okay, what is the positive agenda for that Johnson or Trump wants to accomplish in government in any area that he wants people to roll up their sleeves and to get to work on? It's It's more of a matter of, okay, there's the witch over there, go burn her or something. It's that level of mobilization. And you're right, there are people who are very, very good at that. And in some ways, it is the antithesis of the kind of the mobilization where you have to come and say, hey, we've got this big thing we need to build over here. Let's, are you with me? Are we for rolling up your sleeves and building this big thing? It's hey, let's not build something, let's burn it down. And that seems to be, unfortunately, the only thing that certain politicians seem to know how to do.
Jon?
Yeah, I just wanted to say also that one thing is the worry about fake news in general. I mean, the worry that basically that vulnerable groups are targeted with false information. That's what it is, right? There's false information everywhere, and so on. I mean, that's not the problem per se, it's the way it's used. But what we also see, and that's also the frightening development of democratic politics, is the normalization of this. It's sometimes very difficult to make the distinction between scam or fake intervention in political debates and genuine intervention. I mean, once the propaganda purposes of whatever forces there are among many in a democratic society, once they have appropriated the styles and means of others who are genuine, right? How can we distinguish them? And I think that also comes up with the question of fake versus genuine deliberation. This is sometimes not so easy to say what exactly is it. So I mean, but that sort of points us to the very depressing idea of corruption of democratic politics in general. And how is that to be countered? Well, one way is to say with more genuine deliberation in some sense. It's not, you can't build these defense mechanisms that are going to detect the false information and warn people about it or something. That's just not going to be possible. The only possible thing would be to create more genuine deliberation, right? So,
thank you very much. Are there any further questions or comments?
I haven't spoken a lot about the solution to this. It might sound a bit simplistic, but I think what we're lacking is education. And I think it's not a matter of teaching more mathematics or whatever. There are some big gaps in our school curriculum. I would actually propose that we should have a subject in the school curriculum of politics. And we also should have a subject of macroeconomics, so that the electorate is equipped to make reasonable decisions. To me, that's our big failing. Thank you.
Yeah, Elena, sure.
Yeah. I teach to my students every year. We create a deliberative forum as a part of a subject on theories of democracy, because I think it's important, and I think it's something that afterward can have an effect. But in general, the question of the civic education is very, very controversial. They have tried to just put it further in many countries, and in each country has its peculiarities. So it's something that is in all the new European horizon, and we have a section on civic education. There are a lot of projects, there are a lot of initiatives, but the question is that this usually is very, very controversial to teach about politics. I can tell you as a teacher of politics and not being a chemistry. They respect the teacher, and when they look at you, they say, well, which is her position, ideological position, and then it changed. In Spain, for example, and I'm going to give you an example, but you can think on Germany, you can think in Austria, but the question is on some values and ethics, and is something that is controversial. But speaking technically about that, for some colleagues, they think that the best way of teaching this is not on a specific subject called politics or something like this, but in a transversal way. So, for example, my daughter now has grown out a lot. She's 21, but in the school they started in the morning with the assembly, for example, and they have some subjects that, of course, in Spain are very controversial, that you can imagine, on history and many, many other things. So there is always the debate. Do we need a specific subjects to teach this, or to teach politics? To teach it has to be included in many different subjects, but at the same time, and this is very important, to teach citizens in a democracy how to be citizens is something that should be part of a process of socialization in a type of school, in a type of discourses, etc. That's what I can say.
Thank you very much. Yanina, yes.
I would like to add, of course, it's a very complex question, and we could discuss for hours and hours so many different solutions, also potential solutions. But I would like to add two. One refers to the political environment. I think there is a need to change the political incentives. In my reading of many political party systems in different countries, there are something I like to call perverse incentives. When parties are running for power, once they are in power, they want to keep it. And if they are in the opposition, they want the power. So the incentives are for increasing polarization. Whatever the government does, for the opposition is bad. And vice versa. Whatever the opposition does, for the government is just anti-systemic and goes against the fundamental values. And then the vocabulary is also like more and more alarming. Some things are really alarming, others not, but are framed with these words. X decision will lead the country to catastrophe. To change these incentives, there are many potential solutions. I think one, and I'm Argentinian, so I thought on that for my born country, is, for instance, by law, by the Constitution, select some key decisions which could be required to ratify by referendum. For instance, in the case of Argentina, if you take the negotiations of the external debt and you put it into a referendum, then the parties lose the incentives to fight each other, and they have more incentives to just resolve the problem. I think climate, for instance, could be another fundamental issue in which, in my view, should be in the Constitution that for X absolutely relevant decisions, this should be ratified in referendum, as it is in Switzerland, for instance, for international agreements or constitutional changes. I think it's very important. In countries where these incentives are on the plate, everything changes. Uruguay is also an example of that. Then, when a government having a majority promotes a decision, they know in advance that will be a referendum. And it adds incentives for more deliberation and discussion. It's not a magic solution. It could work, maybe not. But I think it introduced very good incentives. And the second point, a bit more broad, because it's not my area of expertise, but I think it's absolutely key and relates to two of your questions, is the mass media environment and the social networks environment. It's really challenging because as soon as you speak about that, we have freedom of expression in the plate and many challenges, but something needs to be done. Because as with these perverse incentives in the political party systems and in the electoral arena, I think the same applies for the media, because media now are just looking for increasing their audience. And we all know that you increase the audience just with amarillismo, with fake news, with scandals, so this is problematic for politics. It's problematic in general for society. But I don't know what, but something should be done on this.
You wanted to say something?
Maybe.
And then I would like to come to an end pretty soon.
Okay.
Yeah,
just
no, go ahead.
yeah. just to follow up on an answer to your question, I mean, I think education is clearly, in my view, also the main point, because there have been, in the discussion for the last 5-10 years or so, since this sort of became one of the major problems of democratic politics, right? The idea whether it's most important to prevent this somehow, to stop it, or to create defense mechanisms that every individual simply has to acquire. And I think that's, slowly, I think that's clearly the point. I mean, we need defense mechanisms to be able to sort out and understand the propaganda, disinformation, and so on that we are flooded with every day. I became really pessimistic a few years ago when I had a very sharp student who came to my office one day and said, you know, I've been thinking about this Pizzagate problem. It really is, there really is something in it. And I thought, if such a sharp and well-educated person really falls for this, you know, where is the world going? You know, it's sort of that kind of idea. But I think there's also one other thing I want to mention, which is, I mean, we have been talking about deliberation very much in the way ordinary citizens, non-elected people can affect policies, can influence policies. So this is a kind of a vertical idea of participation. But I think it's also very important to think about a more horizontal view of participation, where we are not so much thinking about actually influencing policies, but just the discussion itself. And I mean, I think if we go back to the 50s and 60s, when people like Hannah Arendt were writing and so on, they were not so much thinking about the sort of the vertical view. They were thinking about political participation in precisely this sense, in the way that people simply talk to each other and so on. And I mean, I guess that's also pretty much the Habermasian model in the end, you know, that it is important that people are interested in politics and talk about it, talk to each other and so on, trust each other, not necessarily, you know, what is my, how much possibility do I have to actually influence the policies that are being made on a governmental level.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you very much for being here and sharing your time with us. I thank you for being active here as panelists and enter into a debate and get engaged with your views and with your expertise. And I would like to close this afternoon session. It's 8:30. We talked a lot, and I hope you take some of these things with you, and it was a positive event. Thank you very much for joining us.